I'm going to introduce myself and my co-panelists in a minute. But first I just want to sort of say that by way of background and context, this particular panel is going to be about wildfire. And not just wildfire, but really some of the feedback loops between urban development and environmental risk that have really continued to proliferate and accelerate throughout fire-prone regions here in California, the American Midwest more broadly, and really the entire world. If you're from California, especially if you're from Southern California, you already know this. But over the past couple of decades, wildfire has very quickly become kind of one of the most challenging and significant environmental hazards for communities all over the world. This past year alone, right, we saw record-shattering wildfires in Canada, here in the US, in South America, in the Mediterranean, a particularly devastating fire towards the end of the season last year in Lahaina and Maui. And you know, the fires that we're seeing today are much larger, they're burning much hotter, and they're much more complex in terms of their behavior than wildland fire experts have been accustomed to over the past century. And you know, just to kind of put some numbers to it, in California alone, right, the 20 most destructive wildfires of all time have happened in the past 6 years. And as we keep learning, right, the impacts of these fires go way beyond the kind of structure loss and destruction of forested areas. This past year alone, smoke from the Canadian wildfires, for instance, put about 70 million people under air quality alerts, right? So this is really an environmental crisis that is unfolding at scales that are frankly unprecedented and affect a huge cross-section of the global population. And the other point that I want to make in this sort of intro here is that it's not just that fires are getting bigger, hotter, more complex, they're also becoming more urban. In the US, models show that about 1 in 5 households have a significant wildfire exposure risk within the next 20 years. And this has extreme economic consequences. It has extreme social ramifications in terms of how and if homes are insured, how municipalities that are already quite fiscally strapped will marshal resources for reducing risk, especially in the most vulnerable communities. And this is really in part what makes fire such an important issue for us as practitioners. Particularly, I'm talking for myself as a landscape architect, but also for planners and for urban designers. Whatever kind of perceptions that we may have grown up with, right, about wildfire as being a phenomenon that only really affects the most remote parts of our kind of urban fabric, if you will, are grossly inadequate for confronting the challenges of fire in the built environment as they persist today. So, you know, for us as practitioners working in these urbanized landscapes, it's increasingly important that we frame wildfire as an issue that is deeply entangled with the kind of fundamental processes of urbanization itself, as opposed to something outside of that. And, you know, one of the ways that practitioners have kind of begun to frame the role of nature-based solutions as a kind of an approach to wildfire is by fighting fire with fire, right? So you may be familiar with the term prescribed burn or you know, controlled burn or cultural burn. Here in California, recent statewide legislation has actually kind of begun opening critical pathways for reintroducing healthy fire back into landscapes where it's been really aggressively eliminated through what I would deem ecologically misguided suppression policies. And so just, you know, for those of you who aren't familiar with this kind of way of thinking about suppression policies, you know, you can see that when fire suppression policies first came online, they really worked, right? When you sort of look at the amount of sort of short-term results, right? Many fewer acres were burning. But over time, these suppression policies created this immense stockpile of unburned fuels, which has resulted in today's fires becoming much larger and burning much hotter than they would have in, say, like a pre-colonial forest condition, for instance. And so, just another kind of diagram that sort of gives us a look under that hood a little bit. Essentially, a way that I like to sort of think about fire in the landscape today is that the kind of catastrophic fires that we're seeing more and more of are really a direct result of generations of missed fire in these landscapes. And so now, we're kind of confronting this long overdue reality, which is that we can't keep fire out of the landscape. We have to find ways of actually embracing fire as a part of our world, and as a part of our lives, and importantly for us here today, as a part of our professional practices. So I would argue, and I will argue, that there are a lot of opportunities for designers, for architects, for landscape architects, for planners, to be really not only critically engaged with this topic, but creatively engaged with this topic. I think there's a lot of room for the design field broadly to innovate in terms of helping guide the way that we begin to live with fire. And so with that, I just want to sort of quickly introduce my esteemed panelists who have been thinking about this in their respective roles for quite some time, and will bring a lot of insights into thinking about how do we live with fire. So Greg Kochanowski is partner and design principal at GGA Plus in Pasadena. He also started a research lab called The Wild, which investigates issues related to wildfire and the built environment. Max Moritz, who's with us today, is a statewide wildfire specialist with UC Cooperative Extension. He is leading the Santa Barbara South Coast Regional Wildfire Mitigation Program, which we'll talk about today, which employs nature-based planning solutions at a very large scale. My name is Jonas Suskins. I'm a senior research associate at SWA, where a lot of my work focuses on these feedback loops between urban development, urban design, and environmental risk. So I hope that was a good intro, kind of frame the discussion today, frame the presentation, and without further ado, I want to invite Max to come up and keep it going.
Okay, thank you, Ronnie and the organizers. So I'm a fire scientist, usually one of the worst dressed people in the room. Maybe I think once again it kind of confirms. It's easy to tell who's who. I've been studying wildfire for about 30 years as a researcher, and for the last 20, I've been the state's wildfire specialist within the University of California. So there's a lot of problems to fix. I'm showing you two particularly poignant and catastrophic events. The top is the Paradise after the campfire a few years ago, the bottom is the Hina, Jonah referred to that. But I point these out for a couple reasons. One, they both have a nature-based solution side to the story. And in the Paradise situation, that would be that as they rebuild Paradise, they've been looking at ways to buffer the community with lands that they feel can slow fire down and use those nature-based parcels as part of the way forward. In Lahaina, most of that land around Lahaina was abandoned ag land, right? And that's why it burned so quickly and took the fire to go to the town. The town itself was not designed for fire in any way, but there's a lot of abandoned ag around the world that's bringing fire into urbanized environments. And there's a lot of existing ag that brings our communities, that is providing a really essential service that we aren't really valuing or recognizing as much as we fail. The other thing I want to point out, and I am going to have to skip slides because I'm going too slow. I wanted to add some nuance to Jonah's show the figure of the fire suppression and surplus fuels. Most of us agree that is a big deal, right? Lots of fire suppression, lots of fuel buildup. It's primarily a story that works in forested environments. And actually, almost, I don't want to put numbers on it. There's multiples there. It could be 2 or 3 times as many home losses are actually not in forests, but in shrublands and grasslands and woodlands. So this idea that fuel buildup, fire suppression, we have to increase the pace and scale of forest thinning, that's all true for most of our forests. It actually doesn't really offer us a lot of hope for our wildland-urban interface, our WUI problem, right? That's one of where and how we build our communities. So when people point to me as the fire scientist and go, oh, come on, help us, I kind of feel like, no, you guys have the solutions. You guys, the planners, the designers, the builders. It's where and how we're building our communities. It's not a fire science problem anymore, I believe, or at least it's a collaborative set of solutions. So I started off, I got my feet wet a little bit in planning and building codes. Back in about 2005, I helped Wildfire finish up their fire hazard severity zone maps. My lab assisted on finishing those final steps and getting those original ones out. And I learned, wow, California's doing something different. We're making fire hazard maps that guide building codes. This is really progressive. No other states are doing this. So I learned a fair amount at that point about building codes. But what I heard then and now is, shouldn't we just have better building codes? Isn't that going to fix it? And actually, I would argue no. We know now that where you put a home on a parcel, how you lay out a neighborhood, and then where you put these on the landscape all have really key roles to play, whether that's a survivable community or not. And building codes only apply here, right? Building codes really only apply to the construction materials and methods. We have almost no codified rules with respect to fire about where and how we build our communities at those broader scales. And I feel like this is where all of this room, everybody here has a lot to offer in getting those best practices, those standards, if you want to think of them that way. I feel like we need those standards. We don't have them. That's for new communities. After a community is built, the main tool that communities have is a CWPP, a Community Wildfire Protection Plan. And these are actually fairly effective, again, mostly in forested environments. They bring the community together. It's supposed to be collaborative. They're supposed to say something about home hardening, which often ends up being a couple of pages stapled onto the back about kind of generic boilerplate stuff about home hardening. And then there's a lot of analysis about where do we put our fuel breaks? How do we prioritize fuel breaks in this community? And so it leaves out all of these other things about the community preparedness. It tends to leave out the built environment, road networks, water supplies. It tends to leave out the buffers around the community, the nature-based solutions that may or may not be there but are needed. So this too is a primary tool, but it's actually not what we need. It's not enough. So I have tried to argue, Jonah alluded to this regional wildfire mitigation program. We need a holistic, integrated approach that somehow addresses the landscape scale buffers around the WUI community, the people that make up the community, and the built environment, the roads, the power lines, water supplies, etc. With a colleague of mine, Van Butzik, we put together what we thought was kind of the state of the knowledge. I felt very self-conscious wading into urban planning and design, not being from this field, but we surveyed what we could. We interviewed a lot of fire marshals and planners and looked at what the Australians were doing, and we put together this document, which are hopefully a handful of good ideas. This is where I feel like, we don't have standards, we don't have guidelines that are best practices yet, but this is an attempt to put some of that together, some ideas that came from this. Again, kind of nature-based. If you're going to build a new community, to the degree that you can, pack the houses on the inside of that outer perimeter road, right? Then you have this full street width, a yard, sidewalks, et cetera, before fire comes out of the wilds and into your built environment. I had a couple of fire marshals say, oh yeah, I do this. I require new developers, I stamp this. Sometimes they come back and they've done it, and sometimes they're like, we don't have to do this. Like, we're not doing it. And there's no teeth to any of this, but he says some of them listen to it, some of them do it. Talk to other fire marshals, and they're like, never heard of this actually. This is a great idea, you know. This is kind of this caricature of the historical old neighborhood, right? Gridded streets, and then the sprawl, if you want to think of it that way, out into cul-de-sacs and more widely spaced homes. Well, these are actually very exposed in terms of fire. This green is supposed to be wildlands. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's some hatched stuff there. That's supposed to be ag, right? A picture of how it could go down is like this. Instead, as you develop out into these wildlands, you have clustered development, right? Same number of houses. You've eaten up less of this native, you know, hopefully biodiverse, rich landscape, and you've preserved more of this ag, which acts as a buffer to those homes that are there. Like, this is kind of a simple idea, a smart growth idea. It was actually stolen from a smart growth module that I think we can think about in terms of trying to come up with like ways that people will actually enjoy living in these kinds of environments, because they're easier to defend, they are more protected, they're easier to get water and waste to and out, et cetera, et cetera. And this hatched stuff, which is supposed to be ag here, it really could be any buffer that can slow down fire. And so I want to explore some of those ideas. So they could even be native vegetation, right? It could be riparian areas. These are areas around creeks, streams that tend to be higher foliar moisture. Could have something which we call in jargon a shaded field break. I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. But this is really native plants used as a buffer. You could hydrate these different kinds of green spaces, right? Obvious examples: golf courses, parks, sports fields. These tend to burn less intensely or not at all. And then ag, strategically grazed landscapes or orchards and crops. And this is kind of arranged in the order of kind of native to more, I guess, high ecosystem services to less, but still all acting as potentially a buffer. Is there a way that we can look at these, look at examples, come up with best practices and case studies that end up becoming some kind of accepted guidelines or standards? I don't want to bore you with this. It's a flow diagram for the Regional Wildfire Mitigation Program, only just to say that we have these three domains: the built environment, the landscape, people. We map all of the different risks with respect to these three domains, and we have a way of kind of doing the risk assessment in each of these domains, and then figuring out a way to prioritize how to implement a very large list of possible mitigation activities. But the nature-based solutions would fall into this, fall into this landscape. Which would be this: the landscape, the people, the built environment. Santa Barbara is an interesting case study for this. This is the front country, the ridge line above Santa Barbara. Here's Santa Barbara proper, and this is Goleta, and here's campus UCSB. This is Montecito and Clark Summerlin. We have some really interesting things still intact in Santa Barbara. These greenish blobs and these yellowish blobs, this is all the ag belt that still exists above Santa Barbara. And this is the ag belt that still exists above Carpentry and Summerlin. Guess where we have all of our home losses historically? They're all here. Right? You talk to old firefighters and they're like, oh, the ag belt has saved Goleta and Clark for decades. And we're losing it. Right? Some of that ag here was just rezoned as high density housing. As soon as there are breaches in that buffer, in that network of buffers, fire can now sweep out of the wildlands into those communities. So this is a hard problem, though. There's water policy and pricing, there's land use, zoning, all kinds of stuff that gets in the conversation where we try to talk about how do we preserve and make these more effective. The other thing that you hear them talk about is some other kinds of nature-based solutions. Golf courses. Historically, people have talked about these. This is something I found in 2009. This is supposed to be the I think a golf course in the Yerba Buena fire, saving a bunch of homes. Very little data. You're a scientist, you're kind of like, okay, this is great, but N of one, do we have any data that supports this? Well, a colleague of mine, Dan, put this together a couple of years ago. Actually looked at a whole bunch of different fires up and down California as they interacted with golf courses and how they affected fire severity. And it turns out, in the simplest way of thinking about it, much higher fire severity, this is a metric that they get from remote sensing from satellite data, much higher fire severity in your control, in your non-golf course environments versus those that actually hit golf courses and actually burn part of the golf course. Some actual evidence that shows that golf courses, if hydrated, do their job. Interestingly, they do more or less well, a better or worse job depending on where you are in California. Actually, those in northwestern California did a better job than other parts of California. And that's got to have something to do with what's vegetating them and how much water there is to keep them in place. Here's the idea I brought up earlier, a shaded fuel break. So shaded fuel break is basically just a stand of trees that you limb up and you clear out most of the surface fuels, the surface vegetation. So if fire does come through here, it's not going to burn very intensely. You could put firefighters here to fight a fire, and it's shaded. So it's actually reducing the likelihood of the vegetation that you cleared bouncing back and enjoying that sunlight. So a shaded fuel break is actually like something we borrowed from the foresters, but it works in many different environments. We have a pretty complex way of assessing where in the landscape might a shaded fuel break actually be able to exist. This is a model that shows us potential for restoring or for starting shaded fuel breaks in the landscape. Different colors here give us an idea of where in our region we might want to attempt something like that. And we actually have a little bit of data. We had a fire, the bridge fire. I think it was about a year and a half ago. Sweep, sundowner wind driven, high winds, out of the hillside, burns through this light, flashy fuels very fast, and hit this stand of oaks, and basically went out. Just before it got to this neighborhood, right? So here's an example in our own backyard of shaded fuel breaks working. We actually wanted to know why, so we actually looked at live fuel moisture throughout the season. We went out and clipped branches, wave them, dry them, wave them again, and we get the water content. And we did the same thing for the surrounding shrubs, which is this lower line. And actually the shrubs, for most of the year, are at critically low fire level, or critically low moisture levels, which is bad for fire. And the oaks are consistently much higher than that. And that's actually why they act as a buffer. So going back to this idea of, what can we do? I honestly believe that if we had a set of best practices, design standards, it could come from the green building community. It would speak. It would have some power. CAL FIRE has a land use planning division, right? They don't have anything to point to say, if we had some codified or something too codified, it might look like this. We don't have it yet. So I encourage us all to, and I'm willing to be a voice in this. I'm fairly well connected if anybody wants to pursue it together. Okay, can't do this alone, a bunch of collaborators from the Santa Barbara project, including NASA. That's it.
That was great. We'll do questions at the end. I'm going to go through a couple more things because I think that tees me up so perfectly to talk about one particular project that has come out of about 5 years worth of practice-based research through SWA. SWA has been around for about 60 years. Research has been a core part of our firm's DNA for most of that time, especially over the past couple of decades. We've had a bunch of different sort of programs that have kind of come together. In 2015, we kind of codified practice-based research within our firm through ASLA, which was founded then. we take on a lot of different research projects, we cover a lot of different ground. These are kind of the 4 different ways that we think about practice-based research. We do a lot of horizon scanning, a lot of kind of research with a capital R, things like post-occupancy evaluations. We're looking at experimenting with new tools and models. And we do a lot of advocacy for best practices, for new ways of thinking about things. And one of the things that we've been advocating for the past several years is exactly what Max was just saying. It's just, we need some standards. We need some disciplinary standards within landscape to really think about how to engage with the wildfire dilemma. How do we produce those standards? What can we do through research to begin getting a toehold there? So I'm gonna blow through some of these because I want to get to the central question behind the research, which is really just, it's a simple question without a simple answer, but I think that Max's point about the codification of standards at the scale of landscape is something that we notice is completely missing. There are incredible, there's been a lot of innovation around land use planning over the past couple of decades, and there's been a lot of innovation around new materials and that are less combustible and home hardening, but when we get to the scale of the community itself, there's nothing. And so this is really the scale at which I think we bring something to the table as landscape architects. And so we produced this playbook for the piracy. This is a booklet that you can download for free on SWA's website. It's also printed as a bound booklet that we shared with 100 landscape architecture firms and 100 different university graduate programs for free. We just sent mailers out. And in this, basically this is the culmination of 5 years of field work and interviews and talking to practitioners and professionals from different disciplines. The book kind of starts out with a few different essays about how we got into the wildfire dilemma that we're in today, some of which I covered very briefly in the intro today. There's these kind of 6 rules of thumb for doing site analysis. And then importantly, there's 20 applied strategies for reducing wildfire risk. And this is where we start getting into the beginning of what I think is, for us, an attempt at codifying some of these practices. And I should just point out, can I go back? Yeah. That there's also 100 or more references that are keyed to the individual strategies within the booklet. So if you want to dive in deeper as fits your needs for your particular site, you can do that. And a lot of Max's and Van's work is actually referenced in there as well. So you can see how this is starting to shape up. This is just really, I want to make the point here that when we started this project, the first thing we tried to identify was, where is the knowledge base for designers? And quickly we realized that it doesn't really exist. What designers have been doing, what practitioners have been doing is borrowing and stealing and mining knowledge bases that come from different disciplines that are quite siloed typically. So these are things like forestry, fire science, agriculture, environmental policy, traditional land stewardship. And we really wanted to make a publication that could begin to codify all that specifically for practitioners. We intentionally wanted this to be simple, easy to read, not requiring advanced fire science background or ecology even, but with a kind of a generalist sense of how natural systems work. We broke everything into these 3 basic categories: prepare, harden, and buffer. And as you can see in some of the spreads, these are all spreads that are looking at site analysis. We all as practitioners, we do site analysis all the time. We go onto our site, we have a look at, whether we're doing it remotely or in person. We're doing slope analysis, we're understanding terrain, we're trying to do an inventory of vegetation, but we're almost never doing it within the context of wildfire. So what we lay out here is sort of how to evaluate fuels, fuel types, terrain, fire seasonality, as a way of sort of bringing some of these core pieces of information to the very first parts of a project through site analysis. Once we get into the strategies themselves, we really want to focus on what are the things that are specifically and typically or traditionally within the scope of services for a practicing landscape architect. That was a very important criteria for us. So we're not really getting into policy making. We're not really getting into home hardening quite as much, but we are thinking about defensible space. We are thinking about choosing vegetation that has qualities like the ones Max was mentioning, with higher foliar moisture, more turgidity, less resins, producing less leaf litter. If we start to think about plant selection in terms of how various plant morphology produces different kinds of wildfire risk, we already have a lot of the tools that we need for making those decisions. It's just about reframing the process a little bit. And here's another example of a shaded fuel break, and Max did a great job explaining what a shaded fuel break was. I'll just say that all of the strategies that are in this publication come out of site visits, field work. In this case, we were working with the Paradise Recreation and Parks District as they were developing their plans for creating a town-wide buffer. They came to us and asked, can you give us some examples of how this might actually shape out? This is a completely innovative strategy. We've never done anything like this. Wildfire risk reduction buffers at a citywide scale. What does that look like? What does it feel like? What are the design opportunities? What are the planning opportunities? How can we start to provide our constituents with a sense of how this might unfold for them? This happens to be a shaded fuel break right outside the town of Paradise. This was one of the only places where this incredibly fast-moving wind-driven fire slowed down, came down out of the canopy, dropped to the ground, and was slowed down enough that wildfire fighters were able to actually suppress the fire here. So just some more examples. One of the things that we point out here, just as an example of one of the strategies that I think is particularly relevant to this conversation, is number 17 here, identify emergency refuge areas. This is something we don't do a whole lot of in practice, but a report came out last August in the aftermath of the Camp Fire up in Paradise, and it identified just the incredible value of these emergency refuge areas, which saved hundreds of lives. People who realized they couldn't get out because the roads were jammed, that most of the deaths were actually in people trapped in vehicles trying to flee the fire. People were able to find emergency refuge areas in small neighborhood parks. We design neighborhood parks all the time, but we don't typically think of them as emergency refuge areas. And again, it's just about shifting our focus a bit. It's about aligning what we do with the kinds of nature-based strategies and solutions that are focused more explicitly on wildfire. I think that's something that we really need to be doing as an industry, as a profession, as a kind of inter-professional cohort, is really kind of spotlighting and providing our constituents and our clients with the kind of advocacy for these sorts of things, and really talking about parks as emergency refuge areas in wildfire-prone areas, for instance, right? And the last thing I just want to say is, again, about scale. It is that all of the strategies that are brought up in this booklet are very explicitly scalable to the entire community scale. So this is not, these are not strategies that are about a particular parcel or property. These aren't strategies that are at the scale of regional or county-wide land use patterns. These are strategies that really implicate the subdivision, the master plan community, the small rural town, the community scale. That was really important for us. We've begun deploying some of these strategies in our project work, working with clients, advocating for design decision-making. That has been extremely helpful. We've been winning work with this as well, so I'll put that out there, right? This is, clients are dealing with this, more than we are, right? They're uniquely aware of the challenges of existing in a wildfire-prone landscape. And I think this is really where it's sort of our opportunity to step up and provide some guidance, the same way that we as a discipline have been able to do in terms of things like coastal flooding, right? I think designers have been leading the intellectual charge around climate adaptation for a long time. Mostly that's been around flooding, both coastal and non. But I think we do bring a unique approach and some unique skill sets to the table. We can really start shaping the discussion around climate adaptation vis-a-vis wildfire. So that's sort of my call to action. And then I want to just pass the mic to my dear friend, Greg.
So we get into it a little bit. So I'm an architect and a landscape architect, and so I come from I'm a designer, and so I come from a perspective that is maybe a little bit maybe different from Max, definitely different from Max in some respects, and Jonah just in terms of disciplinary orientation in other respects. And I think that one thing I wanted to start with was just to say, with this statement, that wildfire has existed in Southern California for centuries. It is not an event, but a landscape system that other landscape systems have co-evolved with. The normal cycles of these ecosystems have been completely altered by human intervention, suppression, and climate change. And how can we understand fire not as a destructive, but part of a larger life force? And I think typically, whoa, that's blurry. Typically fire, historically, this is, I won't go into the myth of how coyotes stole fire, but fire is embedded into our cultural constructs, into us as human species, as long as we've been sort of societal sort of entities. And it's always been seen as a creative force. Fire is something that has built society around cooking. It has kept people warm. It was an early form, an early invention of sort of cultural gathering. And so I think part of this discussion around fire is that typically fire is seen as something to keep away, something to keep away from. It seems crazy to say that you would want to be living amongst fire, amongst wildfire. I remember Max saying at one point, I'm going to bring this up, it's like he said this at another time, was sitting in your living room watching the wildfire roll by. And it sounds crazy, but I think that we have a relationship to fire that has exacerbated based on our development within it. And the development of the WUI, wildland urban interface, is the fastest growing, if you want to call it land use, or land type in the continental United States. And you can see here, the WUI is really that proximity of the built environment to sort of wildlands or sort of natural ecosystems that are fire adapted landscapes. And as we have built into these environments, we have exacerbated along with climate change, our presence has exacerbated the amount of wildfire, the frequency of wildfire, to some extent, the magnitude of wildfire. And so it becomes a crisis in the sense that lives and property are in danger. But how do we begin to think of if this is not really going to resolve itself, meaning evacuating people out of fire-prone areas? That's not a reality. So how can we learn to coexist with wildfire? This is a map, many of you have probably seen this map, by the Army Corps back in 1944, the Mississippi River, and looking at the various trajectories that the Mississippi River has taken over its lifetime. And it talks to the kind of latent conditions that exist within our landscapes, and the histories that exist there that we have coexisted with over time and adapted to over time. And that got twisted somehow. But if you all turn your heads, I guess, clockwise, this is Big's proposal for a floating city. That there's a romanticization that we have with water. We were born from water, we live with water. Water is a sort of a spiritual and creative force. We all sort of acknowledge that, but we don't see fire the same way. And so these sort of romantic, sort of utopian sort of visions of living amongst sort of a new, water world, if you will, through sea level rise is something that's widely accepted and has been most of the work within the design fields over the last 20 years. But similarly, we have this still latent history with wildfire. This is a map of Los Angeles. The overlapping colored zones you see here are the historical wildfires up until 2018, with the largest one in the lower left being the Woolsey fire. And you can see here that this is an area where, much like the Mississippi that was sort of diverted both through natural causes and sort of man-made causes over a period of time. Similarly, these are landscapes in which wildfire exists. And it existed here before people got here, it will exist after people are gone. It is part of these landscapes. It is part of our cities, it is part of our built environment. And so how do we begin to understand this as not something to try and evacuate out of, which is impossible, but to coexist with? These landscapes are made of a very complex series of conditions. And what I want to talk about here is really, although this is sort of a track of nature-based solutions, you can't really kind of pull the human condition out of a nature-based solution, right? It's all integrated together. So as we look at these, in the upper left, this is just some sampling of what makes up a portion of the Santa Monica Mountains. You can see in the lower right-hand corner, that's my community. This is right over Malibu. The Santa Monica Mountains. To the north is Aurora Hills that goes up into Simi Valley, and north of that, if you know Malibu, that's Point Dume, the little point down at the bottom. And so here you can see from fire history, that's the fire history in this particular region in the upper left, to protected habitats, H1 areas, which actually complicate this idea of defensible space and how we begin to manage our landscapes and also protect habitat, natural habitat, land use, land ownership, topography, electrical infrastructure, WUI designations, ecological zones, fire stations, roads, which Jonah touched on, the dead-end roads that exist as a network within this particular, all over Southern California, but definitely within this particular network. And evacuation, lack of evacuation here, how do we begin to think about those terminus points? How do we think about parks that can begin to develop along those areas? Or how do we think about rejiggering our infrastructure to reconnect it into sort of fire-adapted infrastructure in some kind of way? And so on and so forth. But I want to continue that with also water bodies and rivers and streams and landslide hazards, because the fire problem is not a fire problem. The fire problem is also a debris flow and landslide problem. And so the cycle of drought, wildfire burning, rains that come through, debris flows and landslides create this kind of, lack of a better term, kind of destructive ecosystem, if you want to talk about that as a kind of a cycle that exists. And so as fires come through, rains come through, it pollutes the streams, it goes into the ocean, and there's a whole sort of cycle of sort of deterioration of the ecosystem, even long gone after the fire as well. I point this out, this is a picture of my community in 2018 in the Woolsey fire, where this was a turning point for me. Prior to this, I was studying landslides and debris flows, and understood the fire connection, but wasn't that interested in it, I guess. And it was at this point where we have 217 homes in our community, 110 literally lost, which affected about 300 people. My community is not a rich community, it's not a wealthy community, it's seniors, it's people on fixed income, lower income, single parents, et cetera, et cetera. And what turned me at this particular point in the work was understanding the human toll that fire has, and how can we as designers start to think through the problem of wildfire and community development, back to some of Max and Jonah's discussions. But how can we begin to think through, how can we begin to innovate? What can I bring to this problem? So we had a series of community meetings. We met with individuals in the community. A neighbor of mine, who's also an architect, helped to rebuild our community, which just finished. Our last roads were just poured in February of this year. So the recovery period of communities to actually rebuild themselves is significant. The rebuilding within these environments is important. These are people's homes, these are people's livelihoods, this is where people grew up, this is their cultural anchor. And so it was important that people rebuild. So part of this process that we went through in the rebuilding was to better understand, and this is part of the work, is to better understand the relationship between human processes, conditions, and factors, and ecological, physical and ecological processes and factors of wildfire. So it's a crazy thing to show on a slide when nobody can see what's being written here. But you know, but just to say, the big RAIN you can read, right? So there's the big RAIN: ignition, spread of behavior, suppression, impacts, recovery and restoration, and preventive mitigation. That's kind of the cycle that we see with wildfire, right? And hopefully, ignition is lessening if you're doing more prevention and mitigation, and so on and so forth. But what this is intended to show is the human processes or the human actions and conditions that we're engaged in, alongside the ecological processes that are tied to each of these sort of pieces of pie. And that those are inextricably tied to one another. And one thing that comes from that, I think, is this idea, this is really bad, but I'm so embarrassed, it's like purple and purple and purple, but it is to say that I can probably walk through, you can maybe see these a little bit better. But this idea of a fire-adapted community, and I think Max commented on this earlier, it's definitely within Jonah's publication, ways in which you really, resiliency resides at the ground level. So there's a lot of focus on big ideas, big overreaching kind of plans, large regional thinking, which is all super important. The buffer zones around Paradise are like amazing, and really innovative. I think what came out of the Woolsey fire was also, though, the belief that, and not the belief, but just the realization that resiliency, true resiliency, also resides on the ground within communities, within human bonds, within human connections. And it's actually been proven that in Katrina, two communities existed during the flooding, after the flooding of Katrina. Both were wiped out. One had less community bonds than the other. One was a much less integrated sort of community in terms of social bonds and their social sort of paths. Which the one that was a little bit more disparate due to maybe more renters or other kinds of influx of people within a sort of community versus another. The one that had the stronger community bonds actually rebuilt and survived and thrived and is thriving. And the other did not as much. And that's a broad generalization, but there was a paper, some research done on the impact of cultural ties and societal structures that actually help to resist against, or help to provide a level of resilience against catastrophic events. So here within fire-adapted communities, they are entities that self-organize more or less, or have some level of organization that helps them along to provide for public health, prevention, regulation, infrastructure and business, recovery, safety and evacuation, wildfire response, so on and so forth, through education, through preventative measures in terms of helping people home harvest their homes, help people community plan better, help people just become more educated about their environment, have emergency protocols, et cetera, in place. And it's through that process that I guess us as a community, because we are a community, we're not a single homeowner, it was through those social bonds that we actually were able to get out of the trauma that we were experiencing and come out at a better place. I'm going to take a jump for just a second into the second half of this, which is, with that, that how do we move forward beyond the discussions of home hardening and defensible space and things like that, and how do we take on? I think this is a broader discussion about climate and the necessity that no discipline can actually carry the weight of the climate problem. And no particular discipline has the solutions to the climate problem. We all do our little bit in pieces, but this is a take on Rosalind. If you know Rosalind Cross, she's a famous art art historian back in the 1960s. She did this thing called Sculpture in the Expanded Field, which was about repositioning sculpture, the art of sculpture in the 1960s. And this was trying to think through this idea of what would be a climate sort of model for that. And so thinking through the four primary tenets of infrastructure, landscape, architecture, or anything not defined as landscape, and not infrastructure, meaning practice and policy. Those become, instead of maybe the three-legged stool, becoming the four-legged stool in some way. That then through that we can begin to find hybridized practices or different ways of finding overlap to come up with various types of solutions. So, for example, this is super complicated, but if you just follow the dashed lines, it's like taking landscape systems and practice and policy comes up with, land stewardship, for example, or programmatic infrastructure and architecture become these kind of programmatic scaffolds or community networks, et cetera, et cetera. This became a way of trying to find innovation within the discipline and ways in which we could find, this is me as a designer trying to think through the problem, from how do I want to operate, and who are the cohorts that I need to assemble around me to kind of come towards innovative solutions. The other part of this was then to try and recategorize the conditions of the wildland condition or wildfire through these different categories, such as clouds, transects, fields, and blankets. So clouds are these things that are atmospheric. There it's about humidity levels, fire drops, fire retardant drops, water drops, et cetera, et cetera. Transects are you all know what a transect is, but transect, those things that are kind of linear, a measuring device across the landscape, but also those lines of infrastructure, electrical grids, roads, water bodies, rivers and streams, et cetera. Fields, and then blankets are these things that are really policy. So policy that those invisible systems that overlay broad swatches of a landscape condition. And so from that, I'm going to run through four little speculations that sort of build on all of these. So this one is this idea of marrying electrical infrastructure and fire retardant systems at the same time. So thinking about the electrical grid, ultimately you would bury all the electrical lines, but could you begin to source fire suppression at the place in which the fire is igniting? I'm going to go pretty quickly through these because I want to see a couple of questions. The next is production producers, which is getting to Max's point about ag. A large majority of fires start around major freeways and roadways. And how can we begin to think of, this is the picture of the 101, the map of the 101, cutting through portions of Thousand Oaks, California. To the left is the Santa Monica Mountains. To the right is the city of Thousand Oaks. There's a series of vacant lands that are not state-owned, they're all privately owned, or owned by Caltrans. That can be developed for potential ag corridors that could not only move through the mountains, as Max was pointing out, but actually be strapped to our infrastructural lines in terms of streets and roads and freeways, as well as having a feedback system then into the communities through community gardens and the like. The next is thinking through fuel flocks, which is really using goats for brush clearance. Ojai, this is not necessarily an innovation, but Ojai Fire Safe Council is doing this at a pretty broad scale. They have a large kind of master plan. They're working with local land ownerships, local stakeholder groups to develop this broad fuel mitigation, fuel management program up and through the Santa Barbara Mountain Range to protect Ojai. And so from that comes out actually a kind of an economy. It sounds, if you're a vegetarian, hold on, but it's about, it provides kind of a local resource for sheep's, goat milk comes out of that. There's actually another byproduct of goat meat that comes out of that. But there's also a kind of, but there's local, there have been local local nonprofits that have actually been developing this in conjunction with the city of Ohio to develop this much broader regional strategy for fuel management. And then the last, and I think the most interesting, is this idea of insurance. Insurance is the thing that everybody comes up against, but nobody kind of innovates through. So there's an example of this in the Nature Conservancy. Started this program of parametric insurance off the coast for a coral reef off the coast of Mexico. And the coral reef was failing. And because the city that was associated with the coral reef, its economy, its culture, its history was all associated with its ecology, it was all associated with this coral reef. And as the coral reef was dying, the Nature Conservancy came in with a parametric insurance plan that actually took in money from from Mexico, from the local city, from local business owners, from local nonprofits, and they took an insurance policy kind of out on the coral reef. And what that meant was it created a fund, and that fund created a restoration project for the coral reef and provided for its ongoing stewardship and maintenance. And in that sense, it became a way of sort of insuring against not only just to protect the reef, but to protect the economy of that particular town. And could you do the same thing with wildfire? Could you think of a kind of a Santa Monica Mountain Wildland Management Trust, which goes by Edison, City of Malibu, Florida Hills, the state, et cetera, and pays for sort of science stewardship, restoration, maintenance, that ensures the health of the wildland ecosystem. It could pay premiums to buy a parametric insurance policy in a designated area or a mountainous community, which pays out quickly in the event of a wildfire, because a lot of the times a wildfire will hit and nobody has any cash. And so this would pay off very quickly, so you can get back up on your feet very quickly. And then the last one is it acts as a kind of a self-insurance when the mountains are damaged by a smaller event or extreme drought, but the policy is not triggered, so there's no payment out. So it could pay for the restoration of that as well. I'm going way over, so I'm just going to leave with these 4 questions, which is, how can we adapt to live with wildfires of ever-increasing intensity and frequency? How can we create a positive 21st century methodology for fire? How can we use holistic thinking to provide levels of protection, empowerment, and agency for diverse groups of people? And is there a new design discipline needed that can address the complexities of the climate crisis? All right, that's it.